All right. My clock just hit 3:30, so we will get started. Per Renee's request, I want to welcome everybody and remind everybody that this session is being recorded. So as soon as I'm done introducing Salli, I will turn my video off. And you're all, I guess, supposed to turn your videos off? Recommended? I don't know. But in any event, it is being recorded. And the next speaker in our series and final speaker is on December 8th. And that is Anthony D'Amato, a professor at UVM, talking to us about silviculture. But today, just to provide a little bit of context, this speaker, who's also a wonderful colleague and friend of mine, was recruited in part because our department is thinking about a forest hydrologist as a potential future hire, hopefully in the near future. So one of my goals today was to give everyone the opportunity to hear a little bit about what's new in the field and hear from somebody who's in that role at a different institution. So Salli got her PhD from the University of Minnesota, where she and I were graduate students together, working in Dr. Paul Bolstad's lab, who was also part of our Hanover series. Was it last year, the year before? In any event, somewhat recently. And is a forest hydrologist with legitimate forestry degrees. So not just University of Minnesota, but also from Virginia Tech. She had a postdoc with the U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Southwest region. Is it officially the Southwest? Yeah. And is now, as you can see, at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where she's an assistant professor there. So I won't steal her thunder about the amazing research that she does there and has done in the past, but huge thank you and welcome to Salli. Oh, and I will be happy to facilitate questions at the end, but Salli, you're also welcome to field your own Q&A.
Great.
All right, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Emily. So as Emily mentioned, I am a forester by training. And so actually my position right now is at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I'm in the Earth and Environmental Sciences department. But I always am excited to get back to forestry communities and to speak to fellow foresters. So today I'll be talking about a large, actually forest harvesting experiment that I have going on out in the coast redwood region of the Pacific Northwest. Northwestern California. And so, let me see if this is going to slide advance. There we go. So I'd like to start, and I always like to start with this quote, water is the driving force in nature. So DaVinci astutely noted this centuries ago, and I love it because it's so incredibly true. We know that water is essential for life, and it's really just controls so much of what we see on the landscape, whether it's an overabundance of water or a lack of water. It just drives a lot of our ecosystem processes. And so we know it's incredibly important, and we know that a lot of us rely on water for, say, drinking water and for agricultural purposes. And so as we start to see population growth happening, not only across the US, but also across the globe, we know that we have an increasing demand for our precious water resources, again, for drinking water and for agricultural purposes. And so this is coupled with changes that we're starting to see with the climate, right? So we know that we're starting to see increasing temperatures across the US and across the globe. And essentially what these increasing temperatures are doing is they're rampening up the hydrologic cycle. And so by ramping up, I mean that we're starting to see more prolonged regional droughts, so longer periods of time with no rain, and then more prolonged periods of flooding. And we've certainly seen this across the US this year. We know it's been just a record fire year in the western part of the US, as well as across the Rocky Mountains. And then we've coupled this with just a dramatic hurricane season. And so all of this is changing the availability and the timing of when our water resources are. And so when you couple this increasing climate with this change in water availability, we're projected to have really great water shortages across the United States in the upcoming decades. And so this map is showing areas across the US that are projected to have extreme water shortages with that dark red. And you can see a lot of the areas are in our urban areas as well as the Southwest, but also areas where we have a lot of water consumption for agricultural purposes. And so we know that this water is incredibly important. And what some of you might already know is that forests are critical for supplying the water that we use for both drinking water as well as for agriculture. And so in the lower 48 states, about half of our runoff, or the water that we see in a stream, is generated from forested watersheds. So these are small watersheds in the upper reaches of a catchment. And so these forests are really critical for preserving our water supply. And thus how we manage the watersheds is really, and the forest is really important for not only providing clean water to downstream communities, but also for supplying ample water to downstream communities. And so this is really at the heart of who I am as a scientist. So as I mentioned, I'm a forester, but I'm also a hydrologist. And so I'm interested in how these forests interact with and mediate the water cycle, particularly under stress, so under things like climate change, and also under different stresses from management. And so being part hydrologist, part forester, part soil scientist, part ecologist, I use a lot of different tools and methods to track water in the ecosystems. And so I'm going to talk about some of the tools I use today. But first, I want to back up a little bit. So Emily said that maybe I would be talking about the future of forest hydrology, but actually I'm going to talk a fair bit about the history of forest hydrology. And so as many of you know, when the European settlers came to the United States, they found abundant timber resources, and we pretty much systematically harvested our way across the country, whether it was from the East Coast and all the way out to the West Coast in Oregon. And so with all of this logging going on, there were a fair number of people who started to recognize that by harvesting all across the United States, that actually we were leading to some detrimental effects from the harvesting. And so you might recognize some of the people in the photo. We have Teddy Roosevelt right here, who was pretty prolific in setting aside lands for our National Park Service. Gifford Pinchot, which if you're passing an intro forestry policy class, you would know is the first head of the Forest Service, and his friend and then not great friend, John Muir, in the picture right here. And so they were all pretty instrumental in recognizing that something needed to be done in order to preserve our forest lands, but also to protect the water resources that came out of our forest lands. And so the establishment of the Forest Service was pretty profound for starting to recognize some of these impacts. And with the start of the Forest Service, another important thing happened in the early 1900s, and that's that as we were starting to harvest and starting to see some of these impacts on streams in particular, was that the first catchment hydrology study was set up in Wagon Wheel Gap, Colorado. And this study set the foundation for what we call paired watershed studies. And paired watershed studies are the primary tool that forest hydrologists use to track the impacts of management on water resources. And so since 1909, we've utilized this technique across a large range of different studies. And so this is actually a pretty up-to-date map that I was able to collaborate with, and looks at this very specifically forestry paired watershed studies across North America. And you can see the green ones are our operational studies, and then our red ones are no longer operational. And so this approach is used to experimentally test the impacts of forest management on things like stream flow and sediment in the stream. And you can see we have somewhat good representation across the United States, but we're certainly lean heavy on our mountainous regions for these paired watershed studies. Actually, that lone dot up in northern Minnesota is where I did my PhD work at the Marcel Experimental Forest. And so just a very brief overview of how paired watershed studies work in a nutshell. Essentially what you do is you take two small study watersheds, and these are pretty similar watersheds. So you want them to be similar in their cover type usually, as well as their aspect, their size, their soils and geology. And they should be really close to each other so that they're both experiencing the same types of precip and temperature events. And what you do is you put in a gauging station. So you have a monitoring station where you're looking usually at stream flow, but sometimes we also do sediment and nutrients as well. And you're looking at both the study and the control watersheds for a period of time. So ideally, we'd like at least 3 years of pre-treatment data. More is always better. And basically, you're looking at how both of these watersheds respond to different precipitation events. And we call this the calibration period. And then what you do is you apply some sort of treatment to your study watershed, so just one of the watersheds. Usually at the very beginning of paired watershed studies, this was primarily a harvesting treatment. As dramatic as a clear cut, where you're cutting down all the trees in the study watershed. And then what you're doing is you're looking at how the stream flow in that study watershed changes relative to the control watershed. And this allows us to account for the fact that there are year-to-year variations in things like precipitation. And what you end up with is some kind of graph like this. So this study comes from the Coweta watershed, which is one of our oldest paired watershed studies. And we're looking at actual minus predicted stream flow here on the y-axis. And you can see what happened is immediately following our cutting in 1941, we see an increase in the actual stream flow in our study watershed relative to our control watershed, and that this effect diminishes over time, right? And so this is pretty typical if we're removing all of the trees on a landscape. Trees recycle water back from the soil to the atmosphere in the form of evapotranspiration. And so we expect to see an increase in stream flow when we cut because there are no longer trees using the water. And then those effects taper off because we all know the trees grow back, right? And so as they start using more water, we see these impacts to the stream flow decreasing over time. So that's like, usually I'd spend a whole lecture on this, but it's the one slide overview of a paired watershed study. And so as I mentioned, we pretty much systematically cut across the US. And when we got out to the Pacific Northwest, the loggers experienced or encountered some of the largest trees actually anywhere on the globe. So this is the coast redwood tree. Again, they're one of the longest lived species, so they can live in excess of 1,000 years old, and they can reach over 100 meters tall. Very tall, very big, very beautiful trees, both for their lumber as well as for their natural beauty. And so I mentioned that paired watershed studies were set up across the United States. And so the Caspar Creek experimental watersheds were set up in kind of this wave of the Forest Service setting up paired watershed studies to look at the impacts of harvesting on water resources. And so I'm located right in this green star in coastal California is where this study watershed is located. And so to back up a little bit more, Caspar Creek, like all of the watersheds surrounding it, was harvested at the turn of the 20th century. And so originally this was done with bull teams. So this is actually the Caspar Creek watershed, and you can see the historical photos where I think we have 12 oxen here hooked up to these really large logs that are being pulled down the swale. And these are the large coast redwood trees. And what they would do is they'd use the oxen to pull these trees or these logs down into the stream channel, and they'd construct something called a crib dam or a splash dam. So they'd pile up the logs behind this dam right here, which is a temporary structure. And then they'd wait for the winter rains to come, and so water would build up behind the dam and all the logs would be in the water. And when the water got to be high enough, they would release the dam. And so here's a somewhat grainy photo, but it is from 1870, of the Caspar Creek splash dam in operation. And so if you squint behind this vegetation, you can see all of these logs starting to be released into the stream channel and the water flowing up. And you can imagine what a sight this was, the force of the logs and the force of the water pushing the logs all the way down through the stream and actually out into the Pacific Ocean. And so they would do an average of 2 log drives per winter in these watersheds, and about half of the logs would actually not make it to the ships or to the mill. They'd be lost out to the ocean, or they'd get hung up on the side slope. So I have one more photo. This is from the nearby Elk River. And this is what the logs look like waiting to be stacked up and wait for those spring rains or winter rains to carry them down. And for scale, these are oxen here kind of on this landing, and you can see a person and I don't know, perhaps a dog in there. So just really, really big logs. So after that initial harvesting in the early 1900s, in the 1960s is when a lot of these paired watershed studies were set up. And that's the Caspar Creek Experimental Watershed was established in 1961. And it's a little bit unique from some of the other paired watershed studies in that the actual land itself is located on the Jackson Demonstration State Forest. And the forest is actually run by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, or CAL FIRE. And so the US Forest Service conducts all of the research. So it's the Pacific Southwest Research Station, but they do it in partnership with CAL FIRE, who operationally manages the forest. And so this has been a long-standing agreement, and both agencies have agreed to continue research on the watersheds through the end of this century. There's a rich history of research, as you can imagine. We've been doing research there since 1961, and there are 3 main experiments, which I'll talk about pretty briefly coming up. And so we have 2 watersheds here, the North Fork and the South Fork. The entire watershed is about 2,100 hectares, and it does flow straight into the Pacific Ocean. And we're located about 3 hours north of San Francisco, so right on the coast. And so this is a Mediterranean climate, and so lots of rainfall, over about 1,200 millimeters of annual precipitation per year, and almost all of that falls pretty exclusively between October and April or May. So it's very rare to get any measurable precipitation in the summer months here. A mild climate, so the mean monthly temperature ranges from 7 degrees C in the winter to 15 degrees C in the summer. And these are coastal mountains, and so actually at the, we're starting at sea level, but running up to about 325 meters in elevation, but they're really, really steep slopes. So some of the steepest slopes that I've ever had to hike up with some field equipment. And they're also highly erodible. So they're well-drained, loamy soils. And as I mentioned, we have primarily coast redwood. There are some pockets of Douglas fir, as well as grand fir, and some red alder in there as well. Okay, so the first experiment, again, this is essentially why the experimental watersheds were established. There was a calibration from 62 to 66, and then a pretty typical harvesting experiment, which I'll talk about. And so you can see on this really nice old map that we have the North Fork up at the top, which is the control watershed, and then the South Fork, which was the study watershed, or the experimental watershed. And so the first thing to do in any paired watershed study, oh, there we go. Is my sharing still on? I think I tried to move my controls and I lost my screen sharing. Okay. Remove this, I apologize. One more time, I can't actually see my slides. There we go. Okay, so the first step is to always build your gauging stations. And so this was done by building concrete weirs at both the North Fork and the South Fork. And so here's some construction of the North Fork, and here's the South Fork, all said and done. So this is a somewhat recent picture. So this is it, using a V-notch weir to measure stream flow in the channel itself. And again, this calibration period went from 1962, by the time all of the construction was done, through 1966. And so they were calibrating for stream flow. And then one thing that's pretty unique to Caspar Creek is that they were also calibrated for sediment. And this is one of the oldest sediment records that we have anywhere in the globe, dating back to 1962. And so when I started working on the forest and was shown some of these old pictures, I about had a heart attack. So after you do the calibration, you build the road network, right? So you have to build the roads in order to get back into the far reaches of the watershed. Most of the roads were located right next to the stream channel, which is not something we do nowadays. And we most certainly don't run our heavy equipment in the stream channel itself like they did. These roads were built again in 1967. And you can see some of the impacts to the landscape. So here's a nice big bulldozer up there. We had pretty heavy compaction as a result of this road building phase. So from 1971 to 73, the South Fork was tractor logged. So it was a 66% removal of the existing vegetation. And so you can see now, instead of the oxen to pull out our logs, we're using these tractors to pull out logs on our skid trails and our road networks back up to our landings. So here's another old photo of what the forest looked like post-logging. And you can see the skid trails kind of wind through the bottom of the photo and then up on that left-hand side. And so here's an aerial photo post-disturbance in 1975. So about 15% of the watershed area was compacted, and the roads and the skid trails and the landings. And again, you can kind of see these large white lines are stream channels as well as road networks. So our roads were pretty close to our stream channels. Here's another old photo. So 1981, you can still see the impact of these skid trails. In actuality, so you can still see them out on the watershed today, about 40 years later. Sometimes they're pretty nice because it gives you a nice route back up the watershed when you're hiking with your equipment, but they're still prevalent out there today. Okay, so here are some of the results from that initial harvesting experiment. And so here on the x-axis, we have the North Fork cumulative peak flows. So this is looking at the largest storm events of the year and the peak flows from those events. And then the South Fork on the y-axis. And so pre-roads, you can see this nice one-to-one line. So there's a really strong relationship between the flow that's happening in the North Fork relative to the South Fork. This road building phase in 68 right there, you can see that this relationship between the North Fork and the South Fork didn't actually change all that much. So despite the fact that they were running equipment in the stream channel, there was no big impact to the stream flow from that road building phase. Then in 1972, the logging happens, and you can see that we've shifted these two lines. And so what happened was that we had slightly higher stream flow in the South Fork relative to the North Fork. Actually not as high as we would have expected from this watershed. And when they dug into the data in a little bit more detail, they found that for the most part, it was really early storms in the season that had the biggest increase in flow. And so essentially you had this increase in flow in the early events, but at some point the whole watershed was wet and saturated. And at that point, you didn't see a big change in stream flow in the harvested watershed relative to the control. So in terms of the sediment data, here we have kind of a similar setup. So anything above that zero line means that the South Fork or the study watershed had greater sediment relative to the control watershed. And you can see that there was an increase in sediments in that road building phase as well as the logging phase. But they found that these impacts tapered off really quickly. So, you know, you're harvesting in the early 70s, and by 75, it's decreasing. And by 1980, they couldn't find any impacts on sediment from either the road building or the logging. So I want to just pretty briefly go over the North Fork experiment. So in the 1980s, they gauged the North Fork, right? So this was our control watershed. And instead, they put up gauging stations in the sub-watersheds of this larger North Fork watershed. And so there's calibration from 1985 to 89. And instead of that 2/3 selection harvest, these were cable yarded cleared cuts. So now we're using a series of cables to pull the logs out. So pretty minimal impact to the soils from this cable yarding, but now clear cuts also instead of that 2/3 removal. And so here's a different graph looking at the data. So this is percent departure from the expected, so our treatments versus our controls. And here they found that midwinter storm flows did increase an average of 27%. So again, with that 2/3 harvest tractor logging, we didn't see any increase to those mid-season storms. And now with a clear cut, you have. And digging into some modeling with these data, they found that the largest increases were related to our soil wetness or our antecedent moisture conditions, as well as how much of the watershed was actually logged, the storm size, and the time since logging. So lots of factors go into whether or not a watershed is going to respond to something like a harvesting event. One thing that they did find in the North Fork was that they had a lot of slope failures, particularly below the road network. So now the road networks were higher on the ridge relative to, compared to closer to the stream channel. And as I mentioned, these are highly erodible soils. And so when you remove a large swath of trees or all of the trees, they really compromise that slope stability. And so had a lot of slides following the North Fork. Okay, so this sets up the experiment that I've been working on. And so in the early 2000s, they decided that there would be another harvesting experiment, but this time in the South Fork. And so they instrumented all of the South Fork with gauging stations. And this planning started in 2001. And you'll notice the calibration went from 2001 to 2016. So a much longer calibration than we're used to. And so this had to deal with some turnover at the Forest Service, as well as a lawsuit against CAL FIRE. And so they weren't actually allowed to harvest anything during that lawsuit. So the upside to that is that we have a really beautiful data set of 15 years of pre-treatment data with these watersheds. And I have a grad student that's just getting started on some analysis of that. And so harvesting in 2017 and 2018. And so as I mentioned, there are a series of sub-watersheds. So there are actually 8 gauged watersheds that are our study watersheds. And then we have a handful of gauging stations that are downstream so that it allows us to look at those cumulative watershed impacts. So for the soil scientists, we're alpha sols and ultisol soils, and then a pretty big range of elevations here as well. And so typically with our paired watershed studies, we're really looking at cause and effect, right? So we're looking at this large scale event across a watershed and then seeing what it does to pretty specifically stream flow and sediment. And so the goal of the third experiment was to really understand what's happening on the landscape with the different processes that we're impacting by the harvesting experiment. And so we're kind of viewing this as a dialing down into the hill slope response. And for this, we're using a little bit of a different study design. So we're using a regression-based design. So now instead of having, say, replicates across the landscape, we're instead using varying levels of harvesting intensity. So we have a few watersheds that were controls where we have no harvest. And then we started at 25% removal of the pre-treatment or the pre-harvest basal area, and then incrementally all the way up to 75% reduction in our canopy. And the goal with this was that hopefully by looking at our reduction in stand density or our harvesting intensity and some other metric like peak flow or sediment, that we could identify thresholds where we might start to see an impact on different hydrological processes using this different design. And so this is what it looked like on the landscape where we have our target watersheds at different harvesting intensities. This did look a little bit different by the time everything was said and done. So I designed this experiment in front of my computer without really any acknowledgement of the pretty strict forest practice rules that California adheres to. So in actuality, we have like one of these watersheds, we couldn't harvest half of it because of marbled murrelet habitat. And we also had to stay pretty far out of the water lake course protection zone. And so some of these watersheds are pretty patchy when all is said and done. And so in 2017 and 2018, these sub-watersheds were harvested, again, using primarily cable yarding techniques. And here's what we look like, some aerial photos after the harvest. And this gives you a really good idea of the patchiness of some of the actual harvests. And you can see up in this top right-hand corner is our highest harvest watershed, and you can pick out the management, the stream side zone right there with all of our trees left behind. So there are actually about 15 studies going on as part of this larger third experiment. And the studies that I'm most interested in understanding how this harvesting impacts the catchment water budgets, as well as how water is flowing through the subsurface post-harvest, and what it's doing to the plant water use of the trees left behind on the landscape. And I'm going to briefly talk about 3 studies that I've been doing in conjunction with the third experiment. But these studies all, again, take place in the South Fork, and they're taking place in a series of transects. So you'll notice these green triangles right here in the Tree, the Uke, the Will, and the Zemer watersheds. And so what we have here are transects starting at the riparian zone, so right next to the stream channel, running up through the toe slope, the side slope, the shoulder, and then the summit or the ridge top position. So we have 5 study locations across each of these watersheds. And in each of the study locations, we have essentially circular plots. At the center of the plot, we have a tree instrumented with sap flow, which gives us tree transpiration. We also monitor the microclimate, so temperature and relative humidity and solar radiation. We monitor shallow groundwater with a piezometer, and we also measure soil moisture at varying depths. And so all of the studies will take place in those, I guess I should say, we have four watersheds. The Will is 0%, and then we're at 35% reduction in pretreatment basal area, 55% reduction, and then 75% reduction. Okay, so the first study that I want to talk about is looking at hill slope soil moisture dynamics. And so understanding how soils store and release water is really important for understanding the responses that we'll see post-harvest and for understanding how stream flow is generated. And so the overarching goal of this research question was to characterize the distribution and patterns of soil moisture across these hill slopes, and to truly understand when we're getting converging or diverging soil moisture states across vertical soil profiles. And so for this one, I mentioned that we're in a subset of the watersheds. This is just looking at pre-treatment data, and so because of financing, we did not have our Euclidici watershed installed when the study happened, so we're just in 3 of the watersheds. And here we installed soil moisture sensors at 15 centimeters, 30 centimeters, and 100 centimeters in the soil profile. So again, going up all of these different transects. So we had 5 topographic positions, and because the cover types and the soils are so similar across these 3 study watersheds, we just averaged the data from each topographic position and soil depth across the watersheds to get one replicate value. And so these sensors were installed by October 1st of 2015, and then continued to record 10-minute data until September 30th of 2017. And that October 1st to September 30th is what we call a water year, because hydrologists are just a little bit different. So we had 2 water years of data. And again, across our hill slope positions. So here's some of the data. So what we have down here, just to set this up for you. So we have, these are daily data. So we've averaged 10-minute data up to daily data. Down on the bottom, this is called a heat graph. And so anytime we're red, it means we have really dry soil. When you get up to that dark blue, it means that the soil is really wet. So at 50% water in the soil profile, we're about saturated. The rest of that water is, or that volume is actually taken up with the soil itself. And then we have the hill slope positions here. So we start at the bottom and move up the hill slope. And then we have the vertical soil profile. So again, that 15, 30, and 100 centimeters depth. So we're looking at those vertical profiles up across the hill slope. Precipitation is up top. So you can see the corresponding rainfall events and the soil moisture down below. And so one of the first things you'll notice is that we get large organization into wet and dry states. So we have these nice summer periods where we're getting some dry soils, and then we have soil wet up during the rainy season. And so again, this is consistent with when we're seeing our rain come into the system. Another thing that we notice is that storms rapidly enter the soil and then drain quickly. And so you can see this by seeing this vertical striping pattern that goes up and down the hill slope, as well as across all of our the vertical soil profile. And so this means that we're seeing quick response to the rain as it comes in, but then it's also rapidly drying, so it's rapidly leaving the system. The other big thing that we found with this study is that typically we would expect our positions that are low on the hill slope, like the riparian position and the toe slope position, to be the wettest, right? So we know these are our more mesic sites. Usually you see a change in species when you're down in the mesic cove areas. And our ridge tops would be relatively dry, and those would be our xeric sites. And what we found, particularly in the wet season, is that we have a tendency towards these wet ridges that don't quite make sense in our normal thought of how topography drives water flow. And so this is also evident when we kind of take the data up to a coarser resolution. Now we're average the daily data up to monthly data, and we have 15 centimeters depth, then down to 30 and 100 centimeter depth in the soil profile. And you can see the different topographic positions are shaded by color. And then we have green and kind of a bluish white shading. So that green shading means that precipitation is less than our evapotranspiration. So this means our trees are using more water on a monthly basis than water that's coming into the system. And the blue and white color means we have more precipitation than water used by the trees. And you can see here that even on a monthly basis, our ridges are staying wet, like our riparian and our toe slope positions. They do dry a little bit more during the summer months. Another interesting thing we found is that at 30 centimeters depth in the soil profile, we see this like strange convergence in soil moisture where we can't see any real difference across the topographic positions, irregardless of the seasonality. And we were thinking that maybe this is some sort of convergence of the rooting zone where plants are essentially using all the water that's available in that zone. And then in our deeper soil profile, we have great variability in the measurements as seen by these large error bars around the means. And then our topographic drivers go kind of willy-nilly, where it's really hard to discern what's controlling the soil moisture at those deeper profiles. We can see this again when we look at box plots, and so these are just looking at the dry season. So we've kind of removed those shoulder months. So our dry season is June, July, and August, and our wet season is January, February, March. And you can see that we have greater variability in our measurements as we're drying. Right? So we start at some state and we're getting even drier as we move on into the season. And not a whole lot of difference between the topographic positions across the different soil depths. So the different letters here denote significant differences between the different topographic positions. Then as we get to the wet season, we start to see some of these differences play out as the result of topography. except for the fact that our ridges stay pretty wet, which again was one of the surprising things we found. We have some hypotheses as to those wet ridges. One of them is that we actually have pretty gentle slopes once we get to the ridges at Marcel or at Caspar Creek. They kind of round off in a different way than you might expect a typical mountain system to work. Okay, the second study that I wanted to talk about pretty briefly is looking at water partitioning between trees, soils, groundwater, and streams. And now we're starting to get into some post-harvest results as well. And so stable water isotopes allow us to track this movement of water between, we call them pools, different like water sources. And it helps us understand how water is cycling through the system. So the goal of this project was to quantify the temporal and spatial partitioning of water between these different water pools. And so again, we're back in our 4 study watersheds across our transects. So hill slope positions. And then here we collect, it's like roughly seasonal measurements of bulk water. So we get it from stream flow, precipitation, fog, as well as groundwater. And then we extract water from our soils at different depths, and we extract water from our trees. And so I don't want to spend too much time going into stable water isotopes, but I'll set this up for you a little bit. So on our x-axis, we have our delta oxygen, or 18O. Our y-axis, we have delta 2H. And this dashed line is something that we call the local meteoric water line. And so we would expect all of our precipitation samples and usually our stream samples to plot on this line. Anytime we get points or samples that fall off that line, it gives us an indication of evaporation occurring in the landscape. And so this is from our Zemer watershed pre-treatment. So we have summer and fall of 2016. And one thing to note here, I keep losing my controls, is that our streams, which are in our blue squares, plot relatively similar to our groundwater, which are the purple dots on both of the plots. And so this indicates that possibly our groundwater is flowing into the stream and that they're using the same water sources. What we find is strong organization of soil water with depth. And so the soil water is our yellow to brown dots or orange. And you can see that we have spatial organization between our shallow soils and our deeper soils. And so again, this is what we call pulling off the line. So it's indicative of evaporation occurring. And we would expect to have pretty strong evaporation in the summer as well as the fall. These were taken before the rainy season happened. Then the other big thing to note is that we don't know where our trees are pulling water. So we were hoping our trees would plot right on our soil water, and we'd say, yep, they're pulling from 100 centimeters soil depth. And so our green are our green triangles are the trees here. So we looked at these data and said, okay, well, perhaps these trees are getting water from a source that we haven't sampled yet. So there's evidence from a nearby watershed that trees are pulling from rock water. So that was our hypothesis here. And so fast forward to summer and fall of 2019 in this watershed. So this is our highly harvested watershed post-harvest. Now we have some nice fog measurements as well. It took us a while to figure out how to capture fog for this analysis. And you can see our trees have shifted water sources, and now it looks like they plot right on our shallow soil water. So we have evidence that the trees are using shallower sources. And we were really excited by this. This was one of our hypotheses, was that we would go in and harvest the forest and we would see the trees change where they're pulling their water from. However, everything goes back to a control versus a treatment. So these are the same plots in our unharvested control watershed. And you'll see that they look pretty similar to the Zemer watershed up top. And then down below, they also look pretty similar. So something more environmentally was happening that was changing our water sources in these trees. We aren't entirely sure yet what's going on, whether it was a function of evapotranspiration or catchment physiography. And I'm just starting to dive into our sap flow data to see if it's this evapotranspiration dynamic. It's always a case where you have to have that control in order to fully understand what's happening in your treatment. Okay, I'm running low on time, but I really want to quickly talk about the last study, which is looking at understory transpiration. And so a lot of our focus, especially as foresters, I know I rarely look at this stuff beneath my feet, probably because it's harder to identify. But the understory post-harvest is a really big flux of water back to the atmosphere. And so the goal of this study was to look at the evapotranspiration of these understory species following the forest harvest. So again, back in the 4 study watersheds that I talked about and our same hill slope transects, this time we're subdividing these plots into smaller subplots to measure evapotranspiration of the different species. And so my grad student Shelby used a homemade evapotranspiration chamber. So this is a portable chamber, and essentially you put the chamber over your target species. There's a relative humidity sensor in this enclosed chamber, as well as fans to circulate the air. And you're essentially measuring the humidity change over time in real time until it levels off. And so this maximum change in relative humidity over this time frame is related to the amount of water being used by the tree or the shrub. So jumping straight into her results, she looked at 3 species for this analysis, evergreen huckleberry, coast redwood, and tan oak. And this is binned into harvesting intensity, where we have low, moderate, high, and high. And she did find significant increases in understory ET with harvesting intensity. And so she made 2 measurements. These are snapshot measurements instead of like a sensor where you're getting a time series. So she did June and July measurements, and not surprisingly, July, which is warmer, had higher overall rates than June. And she saw the greatest increases in her side slope and shoulder positions relative to her other topographic positions. And she ran some mixed modeling to look at the environmental controls on understory evapotranspiration with some really high R² values. So if you look at this top one that includes all of her watersheds, she found understory ET was a function of the light intensity in the plot at the time of the measurement, the air temperature, volumetric water content, as well as the leaf area in the plot. Okay, I know I've thrown a lot of information out at you because it's a really big study. I'm really excited. I actually just submitted that soil moisture manuscript this morning. And so I'm really excited to get into transpiration data and to be back studying the trees. So that's the next step, is to look at some of this transpiration data to see what's happening pre and post harvest. I also have a grad student, there she is, climbing that very tall coast redwood tree. She's looking at fog dynamics pre and post harvest, and also how transpiration changes with fog events. And then another new student who just started this summer, who, as I mentioned, is looking at the pre-treatment stream flow data with questions about watershed resilience and recovery following the harvest. So anytime you have a lot of results to share, it's because you had a lot of hard working people who helped you get there. And so thanks to my grad students, specifically the 3 that have worked on this project, Shelby, Julia, and Erica. My research colleagues, Kevin Bladen at Oregon State, and Joe Wagenbreder and Liz Kepler at the Forest Service, and Jeff McDonnell at the University of Saskatchewan. And there are just a lot of seasonal technicians who are constantly out on the forest doing the day-to-day labor and the hard work. And so I'm always grateful to them for all of the work that they do. You know, I'm sure to them I'm devising torture back in the office in Minnesota and then asking them to do it in California. But I'm forever grateful. as well as to our funding agencies. Most of this work is funded by the Forest Service and CAL FIRE, and then we also have some work from the National Science Foundation. And so with that, I will thank you for spending the afternoon with me and entertain any questions. I'll turn my video back on.
Thank you, Salli. I know it's normally we'd be wildly applauding you and you'd hear 18 sets of hands. Folks, if you want to unmute yourselves and ask, or you're welcome to type your questions into the chat window.
So I do have one question in the chat. It's, does your work suggest management recommendations? And yeah, actually this is one of the more rewarding pieces of the work is working with CAL FIRE. And they helped design the study and are constantly providing feedback for the study and for the data. Some of the harvesting that we actually did, CAL FIRE is not harvesting at a 75% removal. That's a really, really high threshold. But I think what we're starting to understand is that there's a lot that you can do with pretty minimal impacts to the watershed. And so that's one of the bigger things, is understanding that threshold response and what can you get away with, and also what are some of the unintended consequences that you have. So if you're changing moisture dynamics and you're changing the amount of water availability in the soil profile, and then you're having more prolonged droughts, it leads to some really interesting management questions in terms of maybe you've got to do some larger forecasting for water availability and change what you might do on the landscape. And so the modern forest practice rules actually were developed as a result of that first harvesting experiment out in California. So they really do look to a lot of the work that's being done in the region to make those management decisions. I should also say they sometimes school me on my proper lingo, which I thought I knew, but coming from Virginia to California, they use different lingo for a lot of the different things. So that's a learning curve for me. Any more questions? Emily, does George have a question?
He might. He's actually pretty chatty right now. Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. It's fun to share this work, and I would definitely advocate for having a forest hydrologist on your team, but I might be a little bit biased.
Thank you, Salli. And if people do have follow-up questions, her email address is right there, or you can contact me to get in touch. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Salli.
Thank you.